Well, making it very short, for Christmas, I got one of these, which I've read. So all I need to say is read the book, follow the advice in there, talk is over.
Look at the pictures.
In true Blue Peter style, here's one I prepared earlier. So we'll give it a go. So I've titled this Flying with Purpose, Early Cross-Country Flights. If I can just get it to move on. Come on, you dozy thing. Oops, it won't move on. Should have checked that, shouldn't I? That's not doing very good. Come on. Now, why won't that move on? Ah, right. Well, what it means to me is, for me, every flight has to have a purpose. It really doesn't matter how long or how short it is. Basically, if I'm staying up in the air, then what I want to do is I want to enjoy the scenery. And really what I'm doing is I'm trying to see how far and or how long I can glide before that damn ground gets in the way. And always I'm seeking to improve the quality of my flying. I think that if you want to go places, then what you need to be careful of is if you're just into local soaring, you can pick up bad habits. The bad habit mainly is that you wander from thermal to thermal, but always in the topmost bit. You know, you find a bit of lift and you use it. You climb a few hundred feet and just spend the day doing that. But if you want to go somewhere, that is a bad habit to fall into. So think about it on any flight. You know, even if you're not yet solo, but you're fairly well developed in your training, say on the stage of learning to thermal, why not ask your instructor on that flight to go to Aqualate and back and do the exercises on the way there and on the way back, instead of just staying local to the field. Think about, you know, how much height did I gain on that flight? Did I land in the part of the field that I intended to land in? I personally have picked up a habit that every time I land, I'll get out of the glider and I'll look back at the track on the field and I'll stop and think, is this the part of the field I intended to land? What does the track look like? Is it straight? Is it curved? What have you? And think about if I didn't land where I really intended to land, why was that? During the flight, go to a specific point and then come back. That's the first harder bit about thinking about going cross country. Right? I'm not saying it's relatively easy to flick from thermal to thermal, but when you take that extra dimension and think about how to get from that thermal to a specific point and then back into another thermal, you're adding a bit more to the quality of your flying and what you're trying to achieve. How many thermals can I climb in on this flight? Can I actually go all the way to the top, drop down as far as I think is prudent relative to where I am on the airfield, and then climb again instead of just staying in the top 200 or 300 feet? Start to extend the duration of your flights in prep for your silver distance and your 5-hour flight. Your 5-hour flight is one where you can literally flit from thermal to thermal in the very top part of it. But for the other kind of flying, if you want to extend the distance that you're flying, you're going to have to start coming lower down in the thermal before you start to pick up more height. And really, it's about learning to read the sky. One thing is absolutely crystal clear. Thermals do not know where we have our waypoints. They don't know where the airspace is. So you've got to learn to read the sky relative to where you're trying to go, or perhaps more importantly, where you don't want to go into restricted airspace. Now, I'm sure that if you sit and think about it, there are quite a few other questions that you can pose yourself to set up and think as to what you want to achieve out of every single flight. Doesn't matter whether it's a 4-minute circuit or a longer soaring flight. I would suggest that if you really want to improve, you must always be flying with purpose. And this talk is really only aimed at getting going on cross-country flying. It is definitely not about how to fly competitions and win them, because I haven't got the foggiest idea how to achieve that. And it's not really aimed at the 300k goal flight. I don't intend going into the kind of details which you need to be thinking about if that's the actual flight which you're planning to do. So we're thinking of 100k diploma flights for the BGA, or 150k relatively closely around the site, that kind of flying. So we can first think in terms of the local triangle which we've got set up around Seifert. At the top, we've got the BGA turn point in Stone. Left-hand side at the bottom, we've got Aqualate. And right-hand bottom, we've got junction 13 on the M6. Right? There, I've shown the distances between all those points. And as you can see, you're never very far away from Seifert. That is a very good way to starting off putting a bit of focus into the flying which you're doing. So that's something which you can do either when you're starting off, or if for any particular reason you don't wish to run the risk of a land out halfway down the country on a particular day. Perhaps it's your wedding anniversary or something, and you really ought to get home. You can extend that. You can do as much of that triangle or as little as is appropriate on the day and your experience. You can start to ask yourself the questions, well, how fast can I do a full circuit there? How many thermals is it taking me to go around that task? Can I actually do it the next time in less thermals? In other words, using more of the height available for cruising and not actually thermaling. I would suggest that if you do 50 kilometers around that task, that's actually a more difficult flight than doing your 50k silver distance flight, which invariably is a flight which is done with a significant tailwind component. And it really doesn't matter where you end up, as long as you end up more than 50 kilometers away from your start point. Because doing a triangle like that, you've got to get to specific points. Part of the flight is going to be into wind. So you're starting to learn the differences between gliding into wind and gliding downwind. Extending it on from there, we've got our club's late task. And at the moment, we've got about 15 nominated points. The first eight of those, which I've listed there, and I'm showing on the chart with the yellow pins, are all within a reasonable distance of the site. I think the furthest one is can't quite see Belvid, is about 15 kilometers away from us, from the site, which in suitable weather conditions is definitely can be classed as local soaring. If you want to have a go at those, then clearly if you've not got your cross-country endorsement, then you really need to get your talk to the duty instructor on the day as to what you're thinking of planning to do, and he can confirm that that seems like a sensible plan. Just out of interest on that, if you were, for instance, to go from Seiford up to Trentham, down to Belvid, you're never more than 15 kilometers away from the site, but you've actually done more than 50k. Again, there's another option for learning to build up to your 50k kind of flying. Moving on, if you make use of one of the programs that are available for helping you to plan flights, this particular one is TaskNav, which is available free on the internet. What I'm showing you there in black, purple, red and blue are all different 100k VGA diploma flights. Like the black one, for instance, is Shrewsbury down to Bridgnorth back to Seiford. The red one is across to Alton Towers, across to Telford Northwest and back to Seiford. The blue is down to Lichfield Northeast, which is well on the way to one of the fairly standard silver distance flights which we have, back up to War and back to the site. I'm going to be talking a little bit later more about the rules for that to be a successful flight. At this stage, I just want to point out that some of these flights are, depending which direction you do them in, you could end up coming back to the site from the south. You need to think about this, because if the winch line is still active, then of course you should not be crossing the winch line at less than 2,000 feet. So either you would want to do those flights in a direction where you're not ending up approaching the site from the south, or you could actually do you could declare a remote start and finish point. So instead of declaring your start and finish as SE2, which is the front face of the hangar, you could declare the old Seiford turn point of SEI, which is at the far end of the trees that run off to the south of our site. Or you could actually use the BGA Stafford turn point, which is only 1.5 miles away from Seiford. If you're a fan of Spine, to help you with your picking up NOTAMs, then you can actually put your task onto there. So on that particular program, you can actually immediately see whether your plans for the day are going to give you a problem with NOTAMs or not. Okay. Right. Thinking about planning before the flight. Have fun with your polar. Know your glider. Right. Perhaps at this stage, I should say that my working background was as a structural engineer. So this kind of thing does interest me, and I've spent quite a bit of time on this kind of subject. But normally, you can get this information out of your flight manual. Okay, your stall speed, your minimum sink speed, and your best L over D. If you go and have a play with your polar curve, then you can pick up quite a lot of useful information from that. So, for instance, like I fly a Libelle. I nearly put the shirt on to advertise it, but it's a bit cold at the moment. And for a Libelle, if I'm flying at 80 knots, I can cover about 6 kilometers per 1,000 foot of height loss. 65 knots, 9 kilometers. 55 knots, about 11 kilometers per 1,000 foot of height, assuming the air is still in between the thermals. But there's actually a lot more information that you can get from your polar curve. Let's see if I can just share screen. Boom, 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 boom. Right. When I was flying, when I had a K6CR, I produced a very large scale polar curve for that. And you can see all the calcs I did around that, which is basically asking myself the questions, well, if I'm flying in 2 knots of lift, what's the best speed to fly? If I'm flying in sync, what's the best speed to fly? And then I could mix those in also with whether I've got a headwind or a tailwind, what have you. And you can start
Derek,
yeah.
Derek, that screen share hasn't worked. Could you try sharing it again like we did earlier?
Oh, right.
Please.
Okay. Share screen.
Just so everyone can see what you should.
Share. Is it there now?
We've got it. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So you can work up all the kind of possible combinations, because as you know, the air in between thermals is not still. You've got headwinds, tailwinds, you've got sink, you've got lift to varying degrees in between. And actually working out all those combinations will give you a very good idea of what you should be doing when you are thinking of what speed should I be flying at. Now, where's the one I'm on now? See, that's that one. Oh, no, that's not the one. Sorry about this, folks. No. Going into the wrong one there. We'll soon catch up. Right. So having done all that, having looked at your polar curve and asked yourself all those questions, done all those kind of calcs, it really begs the question, what speed should I be flying at?
Derek, sorry, could you just share that one again?
No, has that not come up for you?
It's hung, I think. Yeah, it's hung.
Got a little square.
Share screen. Cross-country flight, PowerPoint. That one. And share. Okay?
We've
Yeah.
got it. It's perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right. So from all that, you can start to think of what speed should I be flying in for all the different conditions which you will meet on every single flight. I'm sure that most of you heard of McCready flying. Has everyone heard of that?
Yeah, it talks about it in that book.
Yeah.
So the question is, to McCready or not to McCready? That is the question. I think these days, if you're strictly flying McCready, it seems to me that you're going to be spending an awful lot of time looking at the instrument and waggling the stick around to alter the speed all the time, as the needle on the Vario suggests you should do. I think that these days, most people will fly what's called block speeds in between thermals. So you'll set an appropriate speed. You can see there, for example, 55 knots. You can see that the best L/D for a Libelle is 46 knots. But 55 knots, 65 knots, 80 knots. You can pick the appropriate speed for the conditions on the day, and then fly at that constant speed between the thermals.
Derek, do you mind
Yeah.
if I ask a question?
Yeah.
Is best LD the same as best glide speed?
Yes. Yeah.
Same thing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right. So arriving at those block speeds, really, they are related to the thermal strength based upon a conservative estimate of the peak average strength of thermals you're finding and the height which you are currently at. So it's not a single block speed always in between the thermals. You've got to vary that a bit for the conditions on the day and the height you've got. Obviously, it would not make sense to be batting along at up to 80 knots in a Libelle if you were only 2,500 foot above the ground. You will very rapidly be into emergency landing mode. But actually, having a set speed like that, I would suggest, is less of a workload, and is probably just as efficient, because every time you play around with the stick, moving it forward, backwards, you are increasing the drag on the aircraft, and you're not really making these savings which you would think that you are doing by constantly varying the speed.
Derek, can I ask a question, please?
Yeah.
Are you going to come on to how you determine what those block speeds should be? I mean, I guess it's to do with thermal strength or average thermal strength.
Yeah.
But
Well,
I mean, at my stage, I struggle to know what the average thermal strength is. Sometimes I seem to be going up quite fast and sometimes I'm going down. So
yeah.
what is it you're meant to do to determine what those block speeds should be?
Well, on the McCready theory, it says that you look at the cloud ahead, you estimate what the thermal strength will be underneath that, and that's the speed which you fly at.
Okay.
Of course, you don't, I'm pretty sure Mike Fox said it in his book. You don't actually know what that speed is going to be. But as you're getting on in the flight, as your flight is lasting longer and longer, you're getting an impression of how strong the thermals on that day are. And if the cloud which you're going to next looks to be similar to the one you've just come from, then you know what climb rate you achieved under this cloud. So probably it will be similar under the one you're aiming for, if it looks just as good under that one.
So experience on the day then might tell you roughly what you can expect in terms of thermal strength.
Sorry, say that again, David.
So just experience on the day for the last half an hour, say,
Yeah,
might tell you what the thermal strength is likely to be.
Yeah.
And then you would just use the McCready value for that and stick with it.
well, no, I'm saying I wouldn't use I don't use McCready in that sense. I will use a conservative estimate of the McCready reading, and I'll set my instruments to that. In all honesty, before I take off, I will set the McCready value on my Vario to 2 knots. Right. That's what I set it at every time before I take off. If as the flying develops and the instrument is telling me that I'm actually doing better than that, and I should, and it is suggesting a McCready speed to fly faster than what I have been doing on block speeds, then I will consider, if the sky ahead looks just as good, if I've got enough height to play with, then I will consider adding an extra 5 knots to the block speed, which I've been doing so far. If I'm getting a bit lower in height, if the sky doesn't look as good as the sky I've just come out of, then I'll knock 5 knots off the block speed.
Okay.
Does that sort of answer it?
Sort of, but I mean, I don't want to dwell on this too long because I'm sure you've got a lot more to talk about and other people aren't interested. But I mean, you've got 65 and 55 knots there, for instance,
yeah,
which aren't extreme speeds. So would you just think to yourself, well, you know, these thermals are, you know, looking about like 5s or something, I'll go for 65. And if they're looking a bit worse than that, you go for 55. I mean, all I've ever done is put the speed up a bit, to be honest, in between thermals without really calculating what it ought to be.
Yeah, I think it's all about gaining the experience. You know, if you just put the speed up a bit and you've achieved the flight which you wanted to do, perhaps the next time you'll increase it by a bit more than last time.
Yeah.
So how would you, example, Derek, sorry, if you took your 2 knots of your starting assumption of your climb rate, then how would you apply a speed in knots to that 2 knot climb rate?
Well, the instrument will tell me, will give me a speed to fly off the Vario I've got. Right.
Derek, just a point. Just might help with understanding the McCready ring. Is that what you're talking about? Is moving the McCready ring on the Vario?
Yes, if you've got a McCready ring on your Vario, yes, or if you've got one of the more modern electronic Varios, one of the readouts it will give you is the McCready speed to fly. So you don't have to play with the rotating dial on the edge of the Vario on that one. You just read what the screen is telling you. But I'll come on a little bit more to that a little bit later.
Derek, sorry, just a quick question from me. When you talk about thermal strength, I've seen in a couple of places that the way to define the thermal strength is your height gain over the total time that you spend on that thermal. So from the moment you pull up to thermal to the moment you nose down to speed up off the thermal.
Yeah, I'll say a little bit more of that.
Okay.
On a later slide.
Okay.
Finally, on this one, from the polar, from interrogating your polar curve, you've obviously the faster you fly, the better the cross-country speed. When you're thermaling, you're not traveling across country, you're basically stationary. You only travel across country when you're cruising. So the faster you generally cruise, the faster is going to be your cross-country speed, which is going to be roughly a half or a little bit more than what you're cruising at. It depends how many times you stop for a thermal, basically. But what you will find if you ask yourself all the questions when you interrogate your polar curve, that if you have asked the question, well, what happens if I actually fly faster than what the thermal strength I'm actually achieving is? Although you'll be getting a small increase in your cross-country speed, the penalty you'll find is that you've got a much greater height loss and therefore a significantly increased land out risk. All I'm suggesting here is go away, make yourself a big drawing of your, I'm just trying to see. This is the one I did many years ago. For my K6, right? That's the size in which I did it. Right. If you only work on one which is only fits onto an A4 sheet, then it's actually quite difficult to pick up the differences, the speed relative to the corresponding sink. So I would advise you to, if it interests you, make a big one, ask yourself all the questions, look at it and do all the calcs in each case and see the difference it makes. Also from that, I mean, I just played around with it this afternoon, is I asked myself, I set up a little chart flying at 50 knots, 60 knots, 70 knots and 80 knots over the distance of 10 kilometers and calculated what height loss I got for whether I was flying in +2 knots, 0, -2 knots, -3 knots, or -4 knots. And looking at the results of that will give you a very good idea of what are sensible speeds to fly at. You know, what I was finding from that, for instance, is that if I was flying for 10 kilometers in -2, then the best speed to fly at, with the one which gave me the least loss of height, was actually around 60 knots. I only lost a further 100 foot over that 10 kilometers if I flew at 70 knots. But if I flew at 80 knots in that, then I was losing 200 foot in that 10 kilometers. Now, if you're doing that 20 or 30 times between thermals, that's quite a lot of extra height across the duration of that flight that you have to find. So, like I say, my background was as an engineer doing calcs. I find that interesting, and I do actually believe, in my case, I did that on the K6, and I believe that did actually help me to achieve my goal distance of 300k. The other thing that helped me a lot to achieve that is that I was a lot longer and I got a much stronger bladder. But that's a different part of the story. Now, if I can get this to move on. Go back. Right. This has been well covered in other talks. Certainly it was covered in my silver distance talk, and it was covered far more recently by Paul Witters in his talk this year. But really, just as a very quick reminder, on the day, you've got to be prepared for your flight. You want to get there early. You want to, before the day really, you should have looked the weather up. You should have done the NOTAMs. You want your chart marked up. If you're using electronic devices, then make sure that they are correctly set up. You've got QNH on there. If you're going around waypoints, if it's close, if it's say your BJ 100K flight, you've got waypoints. You've got that task marked on there. You've got the right type of that waypoint verification set up in the instrument. And I'll be talking a bit, I'll be showing you some examples of that later on. If it's a club glider, is the trailer available? Have you got, and whether it's a club or private, if you've got a retrieve crew, food, water, glasses, hat, cream, all those kind of things that have been well talked about. Comfort, if it's your own private glider, there is frankly no excuse for not being able to make yourself comfortable for several hours. Perhaps a little bit more difficult to get seating comfort in a club glider. But really, I'm not just talking about seating comfort there. Where do you store your water and your food? Do you rely on, are you happy and comfortable having bottled water, which won't get lost, you know, down the back of the seat, for instance? I personally have a one of these camelbacks that hooks on the back of my seat with a feeding tube over and is hooked underneath the strap, my straps. I find that is the better way. Also, as Mike well points out in his book, you need to consider how you pee. I got away with it many years ago when I was younger, but now my Libelle is fitted with an ensuite toilet facility. And I find that very easy to use. I personally couldn't get on with plastic bags and tying them up, and then what the hell do you do with them afterwards? So I've got ensuite plumbing, and I find that easy to work with. Also, every time you go flying, I would recommend that you have a means to download the details of that flight. All the club gliders are set up with FLARM, so the very least you want to be carrying with you on the day is a micro SD card, so you can download the details of your flight when you've finished it. Can be a bit tricky with club gliders because of the number of flights that a club glider does. And the way that FLARM works is that it will download the last 20 flights that have not been downloaded. So you might want to think about getting yourself your own personal recorder, which could be a position recorder, which is relatively cheap, but will give you the ability to do what I think is very important learning process, is post-flight analysis. Now, this is a trace of a flight I did round some of our lakes. It was 250K in about 5 hours. But by analysing the information which you can get from either TaskNav or CU, which is a purchased system, as I say, TaskNav is available free of charge. You can actually learn quite a lot about that flight. What you can see on that, well, for a start, 250K in 5 hours is 50K an hour. That's not very quick. But like I say, one of my objects on a flight is to enjoy the scenery. I by no means consider myself to be a racing pilot. But looking at this, you see at the top of that thermal there, how it's all jagged. then if you were trying to extend the flight, that's wasting time. That's time spent not traveling forward, just wandering about there. How often have you come back from a flight? And this is picking up the point which people were asking, which I think Tiago was asking. You come back from the flight and you said, oh, I had 5 knots, I had six knots. Well, here on this flight, there, I remember that, or I can see from looking at the barogram, I hit 7 knots. But if I actually look at when I started that thermal and when I finished it, and the time it took and the height I gained, all I averaged was 3.2 knots. So I think that, for me, that makes the point that setting a rather conservative figure in the instruments and basing what I believe I can get out of the day on that figure, not on that. And just as another thing, that if you can keep within the top half of the soaring part of the day, as long as the lower level of that is not impinging upon your ability to choose a land out field, if you can stay in that top 50%, then really you're able to concentrate pretty much all your mental capacity on flying, looking, reading the sky and making progress. It's only when you drop down below that do you start to, should your mind start to think, oh, well, am I in an area where I can land? Or what have you. Now, before anyone gets too critical and says, well, Mr. Heaton, there you were at a little over 1,000 feet in the middle of this flight. That was actually right next to Seifert Airfield.
So as a rule of thumb, Derek, if we're soaring, let's say around the lakes type of local area that you talked about, is rough as a rule of thumb about 2,000 feet, kind of at the lowest point that you ideally want to be in your thermal, and then back up to 5,500 on the QNH at airspace around Seifert? Well,
no, I believe that it might be next week that Chris Jones is going to be talking in more detail about the lakes tasks. But if you can only get to 3,500 foot, then really what I'm saying is that anything above 1,750 feet kind of thing, you'll concentrate, your focus is upon soaring. If you can get to 5,500 foot on a day, then really you can glide a long way before you need to stop for the next thermal. You know, you can come down to virtually 2,000 foot, you know, but certainly down to 2,500 foot, solely concentrating on soaring part of the flight without thinking about the kind of ground which you're about to travel over it, and is that landable. Now, I'm not suggesting that anytime you drop below that line, you stop soaring and go into landing mode, you know, 100%. Let's face it, if you take a winch launch, you'll come off the winch at 1,200 foot and you're quite happy to try for a thermal because you know you've got a landable field right next that you can land in. What I'm saying is that if you're staying above, if you're in the top half of what you can actually achieve on that day, then really you're free to think about soaring all the time. Where's my next flight? What direction am I going in? Am I heading where I want to do? What's the energy line in the sky? Where's the next thermal I'm going to pick up? Only when you drop below that, should you start to be thinking, you know, if you're down around 2,000 foot, if you're down around 2,000 foot, then you're starting to think a little bit, oh, what's the land like underneath me? Okay.
So there's a question, Derek. Sorry. So in your paragraph there,
yeah,
there are several climbs, certainly in the middle there, where you took a climb at 1,875 feet, and then you've cruised at just over 2,500 feet, and then you've so they're climb, cruise, climb, cruise.
Yeah.
Is that just because you can't get enough height out of that climb?
Well, no. Some of those will be thermal climbs, and some of those will be climbing in cruise mode.
Okay.
Right? If you move on with more analysis, again, this is taken from TaskNav. Again, for that particular flight, what I can find out is that in circling, I spent 89 minutes thermaling upwards. I spent 24 minutes thermaling downwards. That immediately tells me, I think I could have done better on that flight. Right, that is not a very good ratio between climbing and sinking in thermals. So to improve, I should be looking to that to be a minimum figure. We all know every time you attempt to take a climb, it doesn't always work. Right, but you can see from that because of that very large negative thermaling, across the whole of that flight, my average thermal climb rate was actually only 1.9 knots, quite low. That is telling me that there is significant room for improvement there in how I am thermaling and choice of whether I should have stopped and thermal. You can see on that in cruising mode, I spent 34 minutes in cruising mode, and I averaged going up at 2.2 knots. Final glide, for instance, you can pick up off that. Started it at 3,000 feet, finished it at 1,200 feet. Average speed 80 knots. The glide angle of 25:1. So that's the kind of information which you can interrogate from these programs after your flight to help you to improve. If you're using CU, for example, you can get actually more information. Now, most people have a favored way of turning in thermals. Anyone like to say what theirs is? No? Well, okay. Some people will predominantly, I mean, I used to find it when I was instructing, sitting at the back of people who were starting to do, I used to find it strange that the person in front always turned in one direction. Whereas if you look here on that flight, circling, I spent 54% of the time was turning left and 46% was turning right. So what I do at the start of each season is, if I'm on just a local flight, I will purposely try and vary the direction in which I'm thermaling. So I practice thermaling in both directions. I would suggest that if you can only turn successfully in one direction, you're not going to be as successful in flying cross countries.
Derek, sorry, if you go back a couple of slides to the one where you had your paragraph plot, you've showed the black line, so the 50% line going up throughout today, which obviously as the thermals become stronger, the thermal layer goes up. Yeah. But from avoiding the risk of land out, shouldn't actually the line go the other way? So at the start of the day, because the thermals are weaker, you try to go to cloud-based and stay there, and then as the day progresses, you can take a risk to come a little bit lower on the basis that the thermals are going to be a bit stronger.
If you stop and thermal for every 200 or 300 foot climb, you're not going to get very far across that day. So I think you need, what you want to be doing is minimizing the turning, maximizing the cruising. But there comes a point at which if you cruise too far and get too low, then you need to switch off from soaring mode and get into land out mode. So really all I'm saying is that, if I can get to 4,000 feet, I can just concentrate on soaring down to 2,000 foot without really bothering too much about landing out.
Eric, can I add something to that?
Sure.
It's Paul here. Just on that one, if that's actually quite a good indication. If you look at the timing, thermals are starting and they're fairly frequently occurring close together, but not very high. But as the day progresses, the thermals get stronger, but they get further apart. So the guideline of the 50% would remain, because the danger is that whilst you're going in between the thermals, you will actually then end up in a position where you'll be looking seriously at the ground.
Yeah. Okay. Are we okay to move on, folks?
Yeah, thanks, Eric.
Yeah.
Right. So depending upon the type of flight you're doing, then there are different rules that apply to a successful claim for those flights. If you're just doing an SGC late task, then that is for the SGC ladder only. If you're using BGA term points, that can be either for the SGC or the BGA ladder. And then finally, you've got the BGA and the FAI badge claim flights, silver distance, BGA 100K diploma. And they've all got different rules if you're going to successfully achieve the flight. For the SGC and the BGA ladder, you're allowed to start anywhere inside a 5 kilometer hemisphere, which is centered on SE2. I should actually have said, as far as the BGA ladder is concerned, it's centered on whatever you have declared as the start point. So if you declared a remote start point of SEI or STA, then that would be the center of the flat side of the hemisphere. If you're doing an SGC ladder flight, then you're only allowed a maximum of 3 intermediate BGA term points. If you're putting a flight onto the BGA ladder, you're actually allowed to use more BGA. I think that's 4, I think. Perhaps Peter can put me right on it if I've got that wrong.
We're changing the club one to be the same as the BGA.
Right, so I think that will now become 4 term points. Also, for the SGC ladder, a finish anywhere on the airfield is valid. The reason for that is to make sure that people do not cross the active winch line if they're coming back to the site from the south. Okay. If you're doing a BGA or an FAI flight, other than the silver distance, then you've got to declare a start line. That's a horizontal line of 1 kilometer in length, orientated approximately perpendicular to the first leg of the flight. You've got to travel through observation zones. They can either be what's called a sector or a cylinder. A sector is always set up behind the waypoint. I'll be showing this in a bit more detail next. If you're using a cylinder one, then obviously part of that cylinder is in front of the actual waypoints. So to adjust for that, the actual distance you've traveled, you have to subtract 1 kilometer for every cylinder observation zone that you've used on that flight. Now, for the kind of flying which we're talking about here, for the BGA 100K flight, I would always recommend that you're set up using a sector quadrant. It gives you a lot more flexibility. Remember, thermals do not know where the waypoints are. If you find a thermal directly over the waypoint, tell me about it, because I'd like to go to that waypoint as well. They don't normally happen that way. The next thing to consider with the BGA or an FAI badge claim flight is that you've got a loss of height coming into the calculation. The loss of height must not exceed 1% of the distance flown of that flight. Okay, so need to be aware of that. The BGA 100 kilometer diploma is in 2 parts. What the BGA reckon was, as far as the FAI is concerned, you've got the 50 kilometer silver distance flight, and then next you've got the gold 300K. That's a big difference in flying. Plus also the silver distance flight is not to a specified pre-declared point. It can be anywhere as long as it is more than 50K away from your start. With the 300K flight, you've got to go to your declared points. So it's a different kind of flying altogether. It is becomes a closed circuit flight. And on a closed circuit flight, you've got to declare the start and the finish as being, start and the finish are the same, and they're both 1 kilometer straight lines. So the BGA came up with the idea of the 100 kilometer diploma flight to help to bridge the gap. So first of all, you just do a 100K closed circuit flight, either as a triangle or an out and return flight. And then to help you to prepare for your 300K flight, because clearly that's going to take quite a few hours. Like mine in the K6 took me something over six hours on the day. So the second part of the diploma is to fly it, do a 100K flight at a minimum handicap speed of 65 kilometers per hour. The handicap list from the current competition handbook is used for that. For example, if you're doing 100 kilometers at 65 kph, that suggests that it's going to take you 93 minutes. Adjusting for the handicap, if you were to fly it in the club's K8, you've actually got 134 minutes to do that flight. In a K6 CR, 121 minutes. In the Astia Jeans, you've got to get around it in 107 minutes. In a Libelle or the Astia 2 or an Astia CS, you've got 103 minutes to get around it. Now, I did actually work out what you would have to get it around it in the ASW 19, but that's now been sold, so we don't need to give you those figures. Okay. So let's look at in detail of what's involved. Making a start on the flight. So you can see there is the start line. and that's going to be the direction of the flight. Pilot A gets towed down track and starts from the release point. He cannot claim the 100k diploma. That being a close flight, he's not going to cross the start line. It can be used for the silver distance flight, but remember, it is then measured from this release point and not from the start of the takeoff roll on the site. So if as part of your planning for your silver distance flight, you'd say drawn an arc at 50k from Seifert, but then you are released 4 kilometers down track and you land just beyond the arc which you drew, you will not have done your 50k. So just bear that in mind. Of course, if you get all the way to Husbos or Shopton, it ain't going to be a problem. Right. Pilot B releases down track, climbs up, flies back and makes a start inside that sector, but doesn't actually cross the start line. Again, he cannot claim the 100k. Pilot C releases down track, climbs up, goes back and starts through the 1 kilometer start line. Right. He can claim the 100k or not the goal distance. What's the next one? Diamond goal, the Diamond 300, which is again a closed flight. Going round turn points. So there is the cylinder option for round a turn point. There is the sector option. This is the way you're coming in, and that's the way you intend going out. So again, pilot A, he enters the cylinder only. The flight is valid, but you get a 1 kilometer penalty. So if the task which you had set up using TaskNav or CU or what have you, and it was only 101k in total distance, and you actually go round 2 of those, because you cannot on the flight, you cannot mix the type of observation zone. If you use a cylinder for one, then it's measured to the cylinder for the other. You would have lost 2 kilometers, only done 99 kilometers, had a good day out, but you've not got your 100k diploma. Pilot B logs points in both the cylinder and the sector. No distance penalty. The flight is measured to the turn points. Oops, this one. Pilot C makes a wide sweep around. Oh, damn this bloody computer. Makes a wide sweep around the turn point. You're free to go as far as you want. So in other words, if your next thermal is over here, go to that thermal before you head off on your next leg. It's not a problem. You're free to go as far beyond the turn point as is necessary to keep you in the air. Finishing. Pilot A lands on the airfield but doesn't cross the 1 kilometer finish line or enter the 1 kilometer sector. That's fine if all you're doing is putting a flight onto our club ladder. But you cannot claim the 100 kilometer because you've not crossed the finish line. So you can see if you're coming from the south where the problem lies if you've declared SE2, which is the front face of the hangar, right? Because the winch line is going to be somewhere across here. So you're trying to do a fast, low finish, you're not going to be able to achieve that. Pilot B crosses the finish line. He can claim the 100K, and the distance is measured to the finish line. You see, he doesn't go into a sector at the back of the finish. Pilot C enters the oh, I've said that. I need to double check that, guys. Enters the 1 kilometer sector. I'm saying he can claim the 100 kilometer and any logged point. So he can take a point back here. It can be used for calculating the 1%. Now, I'm not 100% sure about that, having written that. I would have thought he would have had to cross the finish line. So you'll have to bear with me that, and I'll double check that and let you know on that one. Now, just a very brief recap on the silver flight, the silver distance flight, because that's a totally different kind of flight. As I've said several times, it's not like a lake flight or a BJ 100K or even a gold flight, because you're not having to go to any specific point. It will always be a flight planned with a good tailwind element. So its rules are got to be at least 50K from the release point and from the beginning of the takeoff roll. Okay, so if you release down track, the fact that you circle up and get back behind the airfield doesn't help you. It is always measured from the release point in that case. What you need to be careful of is if you're going from the release point, then that has to be able to be found by the official observers. So you need a clear marker on your trace. What you need to do is a full 360-degree tight circle or a definite descend for a few hundred feet using the air brakes. And remember, oh, sorry about this. It's a bit too sensitive, the touchpad on this. If you go from the release point, you need to get further down your plan route to actually achieve the 50K. But what you are able to do is you are able to, on the silver distance flight, it's not to where you land. If you go beyond your landing point and come back to it, then you can choose any recorded point on that flight for measuring the 50K. You're not allowed to fly it with guidance from another pilot. In other words, you can't get radio advice or you can't do team flying. But that does not exclude you thermaling with other gliders who you happen to come across on that flight. For instance, you know, if you're say going down to Husbos or Shobden, if there's any gliders down there which are flying locally and you're getting a bit desperate for one last climb and you see a glider thermaling, by all means, you can go and join him, gain the height and finish the flight off.
Just a question for me there, Derek, on that. So on that basis of what you've just said, in theory, you could do your 50K from Seifert towards Husbos, but once you're 50K, you've achieved your 50K distance away from your start point.
Yeah. And
from the start of the takeoff roll.
Yes.
Then in theory, you could turn around and soar back to Seifert.
Fly back. Yes, you can. Yeah, you can. It's quite unusual remember, this is going to be one of your first cross-country flights away from the site. It would be fairly unusual, I would suggest, for the duty instructor to agree that that is the recommended thing you should do. Because if you remember, if you've had 50k of tailwind, you've suddenly got 50k of headwind to get back.
Get back, yeah.
Right. So, and at that stage, you've probably not got a lot of experience at flying into wind.
So Derek, sorry, just on the release height point, I think one thing probably worth sharing from my 50k flight is that, so the plan was always to go to Husbars, but I've worked out what the release height should be on 2 points. The one to achieve the 50k minimum and the release height to achieve Husbars. So when you do your 50k on the day, you've got a release height band. So essentially do not release below this height, and you don't need to aerotow above this height. So for me, I think it worked out, the release height, or the release height band was something like 2.2 to 2.5 or something like that. So you know that if you release, for example, at 2.2, you don't necessarily need to get to Husbars to do your 50k. But if you stay on tow a bit longer, then you know you have to go down track a bit more.
Correct. Yeah, in theory, if there was no airspace restrictions above you, in theory, you could go up high enough to almost straight glide the thing. And as long as you took a thermal then at Husbars and climbed it up and used that as your recorded endpoint, you're well within the 1%. But that, I mean, that's not a practical way of planning the flight. The practical way of planning it is to only take the aerotow to the height, which will keep you within the 1% for the minimum distance of 50k.
Yeah, and I think my advice would be for people doing it to work out what that height needs to be before you get in the glider, because it's very hard to calculate after you release from aerotow. It's very, very, very hard to realize how much height you actually need.
Well, I think it's about 1,800 foot, isn't it, Peter? Something like that. Hey?
On the height loss.
Yeah.
It's 500 meters.
Yeah.
Which is 1% of 50 kilometers.
Yeah.
So if you're going down Husbars and you tow to 2.2, you do your 50k by going to the Hickley turn point, basically.
You're going to have to do about 60 kilometers.
Yeah.
That's basically, if you stay on aerotow to 2,000 foot, you've got to achieve more than 50k, more like 60k.
Yeah.
Right. So this answers one of the questions of Andrew there. Yes, it can be part of a longer distance declared flight, and you can claim both on the same flight. But remember what we've just been talking about the different start conditions. Your Silver Sea is straight from either release or start of takeoff roll. Okay, if you're trying to combine it with, say, the BGA 100 kilometer flight, that has different start conditions. You've got a start line and then a finish line. So be very careful about that, that you don't make a mess of that. You have to make a declaration. Pardon me. And an OO needs to verify that the recorder which you're going to use to prove you've done that flight is fixed in your glider shortly before you take off. And you're going to need the permission of the duty instructor, who will be looking for you to be able to demonstrate to him that you have pre-planned that flight, what launch time you're thinking of, that you've checked your NOTAMs, the airspace, you've done all your personal prep, and the logger or personal recorder has been approved by the OO, and you've got a trailer and a retrieve crew available. Okay. So I will leave you with this thought on this. So remember, what we're talking about here is just flights. See, so doing your BGA 100K flight it's going to take you 2 hours. Certainly, if it's going to take you basically less than 2 hours if you're going to do the part 2 of it. So we're not talking about an all-day flight here. So just to leave you with a thought, right? Here's a sky. We've got a cracking thermal here. We've got some smaller looking clouds there and a really cracking looking thermal there. Okay. So P1, he's going to fly Macready, and he looks at that. Oh, that's going to be a cracker. That's going to be 6 knots there. So he sets Macready 6. And, whoa, significant risk of landing out before he gets there. P2 looks at this cloud. Ooh, that's maybe 2 knots. Sets Macready appropriately for that. Sets it, leaves it set for that there, and again there. Here he's looking at the good cloud, so he sets Macready for Macready 6. So obviously he's flying faster there. Sorry, I've followed the wrong line there. And stops in each of those, climbs up under the weak one, flies on Macready 2, up, down, and he gets, he stays high, but is relatively slow. It's driving me mad, this touchpad. I've lost it again. Don't know what's happened there, folks. But basically, what that, if I can see if I can get it back.
If you just reshare your screen, Derek.
Yeah.
All that's happened, you've come to the end of the presentation and it's ended the screen share, I think. There we go. And then pick your slide.
Come on. I hope I'm better at flying than I am at giving these presentations, or I'm going to be doing a lot of these landouts this year. Right. Well, P3 is a very conservative flyer and basically flies at best glide, which is Macready's 0. He'll get there, but is starting to get lower. P4 sets, as we said, so really he's flying block speed type of way. He's looked at the sky, done it again, it's gone. We don't need it anyway now. He's looked at the big cloud ahead. Yeah, I reckon I can get 6 knots there, but I'm actually only going to assume it's 3 knots, and he flies accordingly to 3 knots. Because he's flown conservatively, but he's estimated he's got enough height to get there in still soaring mode. And he will actually get there, climb up, and be on his way. He will actually make the most distance cross country in the same time. I hope that made sense without seeing it. Okay. Any questions? Stunned you all into silence.
I think my only point, Derek, is obviously that